there's an old preacher trick. If their sermon's really long, what they do is during the the welcome everyone, they stick a little bit of the sermon. And then during the sermon, they do most of the sermon. Then during the announcements, they do a little bit more of the sermon. And then during coffee hour, they finish their sermon. So let's consider this maybe a little continuation of what I said earlier. I'm Brian Sellers-Petersen. I live in Washington State, outside Seattle, in the mountains, the Cascade Mountains. And I have spent my career in international development with a really big focus on was small-scale agriculture. I grew up in the Midwest, in Minnesota, Iowa, in Nebraska, and farm country. I spent all my summer vacations and long weekends at my grandparents' farm, where I learned a couple things. And I've always worked with organizations that are focused on small-scale agriculture to address food security. There's so many people in the world who, don't know where their next meal is going to come from. And so addressing it through simple things like having a kitchen garden or a community garden. And so after I retired about 5 years ago, I decided I'm just going to jump in, boots and all, and focus on food security and what in particular, the Episcopal Church can do. Because I decided, I don't have that many years left, and I need to grow where I was planted, and that's the Episcopal Church. And so I have been spending about the last 5 years involved in meeting with churches like you, traveling around the country, and talking about how we take care of the land that has been entrusted to us. How it can be a vehicle for transformation in our communities, in our church, in our lives, and far beyond. How it can impact all of God's creation, the wildlife, the creepy crawly stuff, because that's a part of God's design and plan. And so it's really exciting to be at a place like this, 39 acres, that's been a part of your lives through 3 centuries. And I understand there's a fox den, so if anyone knows where it is, I'd love to see it. Because you're a habitat for wildlife. That stream that comes through connects you to your neighbors both upstream and downstream. It's really pretty remarkable, and I'm grateful for the way that you have grown people, grown lives, grown family, grown food, played on it. Sometimes I can be a little negative about churches that all they have is turf grass. Everything's just turf grass. And unless there's a soccer league that's using that grass all the time, they're missing out on something. I mean, I've been to churches that all they've got is grass, and the only day of the year they use it is for the Easter egg hunt. And you don't see a lot of butterflies at these churches. Sort of that monoculture of turf grass doesn't do much good. But, your turf grass is being used in incredible ways. And just the way you care. I mean, I just think about, the land, the cemetery is a habitat for God's creation that's being fed by lives and the connection that we have. And so I just want to take a moment to celebrate that. Now, I want to say something, like I've said before with groups. I don't like to let the truth get in the way of a good story, but I'm pretty sure this fact is true. The Episcopal Church collectively owns more land than any religious or faith community in the United States per member. That's the key. Because, of course, the Roman Catholics got lots more land than we do. But, you take our 8,000 churches, our camps, our conference centers, our monasteries, our seminaries, our colleges, our universities, our diocesan offices. And then, a lot of churches get land donated to them through bequests in memorial of someone's lives. And that land goes in, a property manager manages it, and income comes from that. The Proctor family, anyone brush their teeth with Procter & Gamble products? Probably do. They left 1,300 acres to the Episcopal Church in southern Ohio. And all but, 50 of those acres is used for a camp and a conference center and a small a farm that provides for a CSA program. And then all the other acreage is rented out, and income comes for them to use in their budget and for mission and outreach. But that's replicated over and over again. We own a lot of land. And I really learned this in a big way when I was with Episcopal Relief and Development, that these food insecure communities in places like Cuba, in places like Uganda, El Salvador, the church, the Anglican Church, has title to that land. And they don't give that land up very easily. I mean, the governments even don't try to mess with them. I told a story earlier while I was here about a village in Uganda that the imam in the village said, the only land that we own, he was talking collectively, for the whole village, the only land that we own is the Anglican Church land, the rectory and the church. And, that was, to them, that was sort of community property. Everything else was owned by the government. And all the homes and businesses were on 99-year leasehold land that the government could take anytime they wanted. But the community wanted to develop and build things that benefited all and help their community thrive. And so they really doubled down on the land of the Anglican Church. Now, there's some history behind that. Some of it not so pretty. Those of you who are any student of church history know that, when the British Empire expanded, they took a lot of land. And the Church of England, was a beneficiary of that land. And that's kind of one of those facts that we have to wrestle with. I don't have an answer, so don't ask me. But collectively, your generation might come up with some answers of how we bring good news to that fact. We own a lot of land. And so I have spent a long time traveling around the United States, and after all that experience overseas of seeing how we took church land for the benefit of our communities, that it was not a church or a financial asset of the church, really, but it was a community asset. I started looking at church land in the United States completely differently. And I guess it's my hobby in retirement. So wherever I go, I kind of just drop in and see what churches are doing with their land. I wrote a book. It's really a story book. It's called Harvesting Abundance. And it's just stories about a church agriculture and church stewardship of church property. And the publisher, the church publishing that published it wants me to write another book that'd be a little more ecumenical and interfaith. And I said, no way. I'm not going to do that. That was pure torture. So now I have a podcast which I share with two other people that tells those stories. So just kind of put me on alert. I'm probably going to tell a St. David's story. The name of the podcast is Spade, Spoon, Soul. From your spade to your spoon to your soul. And the other co-host, up until just recently, she was the evangelism officer for the presiding bishop. Her name's Jerusalem Greer. And what better good news is there than good food? You know, that's what evangelism means, good news. Good food, good news. It means evangelism. So Jerusalem Greer. And the other co-host is Jennifer Baskerville Burrows, who's the Bishop of Indianapolis, who used to be a food writer and an exceptional chef. And so the three of us bring on guests, and we just have a good old time. But you can find it on all your favorite podcast platforms, Spotify, Apple. There's going to be a St. David story real soon. And I've got a lot of ideas about that. So I really started out, I was focused really closely on food. I used to say every church can grow food. Every Episcopal church can grow food. Now, there's some churches that don't have a lick of land, but they can still grow food. Now, it might be a hydroponic garden inside the church. It might be a vertical garden on the church wall, but every church can do it. Now, I have modified that position over the years. I've changed a little bit. I've changed my focus into what is really a three-legged stool. You know, I'm Anglican, I'm Episcopalian, so a three-legged stool. And the three legs are agrarian ministry, like what you're doing here with, is it the pantry plot in the Good News Garden? What you're growing food for your community. For the St. Mary's Outreach Garden, the St. Mary's Pantry in Ardmore. You're doing that. Creation care is one of the other legs, how we care for creation. And I love hearing about what the men's group is doing, with the wetlands, caring for God's creation. I love the idea of that. I'm serious. I want to see those foxes. So someone show me where those fox dens are. And then the third leg is church land stewardship, how we steward our land. Now, we might have title to this land, but, we are really just stewards. This is God's creation. And we've got to remind ourselves over and over again. And for 3+ centuries, you have been called and required to be stewards of this land. You could have sold it off to a developer. I don't know numbers real well, but I know this is up there, B with a B, billion. But this is a community asset. So I'm going to land the plane now, and I'd love to have a conversation. If you've got a story you'd like to share with the whole group, if you've got a question, I'll probably defer it to someone in your congregation that has the answer, or I'll tell you something. But can we try that? Or someone can come up and put another nickel in me, and I'll keep talking. But in the meantime, some coffee. Oh, one last thing. I love churches that have beehives, because I'm a beekeeper. And I started out beekeeping on the roof of the cathedral in Seattle's parish house. And so I'm very excited about this. But when I think about bees, I think of them as evangelists, spreading good news. Because, you might have beehives here, but they don't stick to the boundaries of St. David's. They're flying into the neighbor's yard, pollinating their plants. And those gardens, your neighbor's gardens, whether they know it or not, are more abundant and fruitful because of those bees that come over. They don't respect boundaries. So just, have to throw that in. Don't let me forget that. Okay, I see that hand. Jay.
Brian, I have a question about bees. Of all things.
Okay.
How far do they go from their hive? Yeah, it's not right.
Yeah. Woo.
A mile or more. Yeah. Yeah.
So my question to Brian was, how far do bees travel from the hive?
A mile, sometimes more, and they know how to get home again. And some of those bees will go out and find out where the nectar is, and they'll come back to the hive and do a little dance, and which is actually directions to the other bees to get to the good stuff. I mean, bees are some of the most fascinating parts of creation in terms of what they do. And
could you show that dance again?
they kind of wiggle a little.
Which is different from their orientation dance how?
Yeah.
So, Brian, you're talking about stories. What is it about the story of Scripture that has inspired your desire for increased creation care within the Episcopal Church?
Scriptures. So, I grew up with the understanding that Joseph, Jesus' dad, earthly dad, was a carpenter. And naturally, Jesus was a carpenter. But it doesn't take very long to figure out that he was really a farmer. Jesus was an agrarian. I mean, that's not a big leap. I mean, most people in Palestine during that time were subsistence farmers, hand to mouth. Unless you were a Pharisee, a Sadducee, a tax collector. Oh, but there were also fishermen. I mean, there is that one story about building your house on a rock. So, Jesus, did kind of let people know he knew a little bit about home building. But otherwise, those stories, just filled. And a lot of the world's religions, are agrarian based. I love the Sikh, or Sikhs, how some people pronounce it, but it was this group of gurus that decided that they were going to start this new religion, an offshoot of Hindu and Buddhism. And they got together and they started propagating the faith. But Guru Nanak, he was the first amongst equals, and he was a farmer. And he went out and propagated the faith for about 7 years. Then he quit and went back to farming. He was kind of bivocational, as a guru and a farmer. And so, and there's this great book, Soil and Sacrament, by Fred Bonson. And he talks about the terroir of Jesus. That, we talk about, I'm from wine country. We talk about the terroir. And Jesus' terroir was that the soil, the humus, the compost, the olives, the grapes, the wheat, the corn of Palestine. And, there's a sermon there, but it's a long way off. But, that's part of, that's what motivates me. I see that hand.
Yeah, tons of questions. So, in your sermon, you talked about in nature you see the resurrection. I mean, and I think that's probably the most obvious, the plainest example for all of us. Can you think of other examples of God or Jesus that you see in nature, or do you see any contradictions?
I hear God in nature. I lived for many years in Seattle, and I was kind of oblivious to the ambient sounds. Because mixed in, with the birds singing and the wind blowing through the trees, there was always traffic noise. And so so it was all just sort of a blank slate. And I kind of rediscovered God's voice in nature, moving into the mountains. And kind of that stillness of going into the Wenatchee Forest, which is just behind my house. Actually, I have don't get me going on cemeteries, because I live next door to one, which is a whole nother story, because it's actually 26 separate cemeteries. So if you're curious, Google Roslyn, Washington Cemetery. But I'll stop there. But, I think that's, for me, it's hearing God in a different way. Being more mindful. I wish I wouldn't have waited 60 years to learn how to meditate. Then, and being more mindful in my daily activities. That's where I'm hearing it. Thanks. That's a great question I'm taking home with me. Thanks, Jay. I see that hand.
Excuse me. Is most of the land placed in conservancies, or is it owned by various parishes?
Say that again.
Conservancy. Pennsylvania is big on conservancies, where the land goes into a trust.
She's asking if the church land is mostly in conservancies or owned by the parish.
That is a great question, and that's worthy of a whole forum conversation. And I think kind of getting someone to come and talk from a land conservancy, and someone, from, the vestry who's engaged in buildings and grounds, and having a dialogue about that, I think would be an amazing thing. But, there is a movement that I'm starting to see little shoots of, and that churches are putting some of their land, unused land, into land trusts. They're putting them into agrarian trusts, because some of that land that they hold title to is farmland that they're not using. And to plug my podcast, there's an episode on this subject. But there are a lot of people that want to farm that aren't inheriting family farms. They're not able to get bank loans so that they can buy farmland. And so they've turned into virtual sharecroppers. You know, they will get a lease for 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years. And, you know, in the lease that can be pulled with a 1-year notice. And I spend all that time building that soil. Fred Bonson, again, he says that his job is to grow soil. Soil grows the food. So, you know, that's the real job and, you know, and then they lose it and they're off to the next plot. And, you know, there's more and more stories of churches and other entities putting their land into agrarian trust for these poor, for these young farmers who can make a living using sort of real bio-intensive approaches to agriculture, permaculture. They can live off that with an acre or two. And so, you know, I think that we need to have that conversation. There was some legislation passed at General Convention for us to get a handle on how much land that the Episcopal Church actually owns and how much of it could be used for other purposes for the benefit of our communities. So, I don't know, did someone plant that question for you? Because I love that one. Yeah, land trusts. I really think we all need to learn as much as we can about land trusts and easements and things that we can do that are going to change things. Sarah.
So I have a
time's
question,
up.
and then Jay has another question.
Jay's got
What time
a
is it,
shock.
friends? Okay, can we do five more minutes
5
and
more
wrap it
minutes.
up? Okay. We have our confirmation class here today. Thank you guys for coming. And I'm curious, since you have been at this work for some time now, how do you see the conversation around creation care changing? And how is it trending for younger generations? And how can young people be involved with this movement?
Keep doing what you're doing. You've learned things since the time you were babies that I didn't learn until I was 40 or 50 years old. Things like recycling, things like composting. You know, just keep learning from your generation. Don't look to us. You know, we're kind of bound and determined to mess things up. So don't count on us. And the other thing I would say to you, take the long path. Take the long path. This church took the long path. They didn't just see what can we do to make this better tomorrow. They were always thinking about the generations to come. And I think we all have to look at the long path, especially during this climate crisis time of our existence. My son-in-law is in charge of all the snow grooming operations at a local ski resort. The ski season has shrunk, so now he's in charge of both snow grooming and snow making. And so every summer they put in more snowmaking equipment. And I just wish we had been on a little bit more of a long path because I like to ski. So, and it's simple things. Here, Archbishop Tutu, you know who that guy is or was? He asks a question in a lot of his sermons to make a point. How do you eat an elephant? Do you know how to eat an elephant? You know? Someone knows. Anyone? Molly, one bite at a time. So all I would encourage you to do is go out and take a bite today.
Yeah, one more question, and I just echo exactly what Brian said. Well, if I have any regrets, I just wish I hadn't been in such a hurry when I was younger. So, take your time. I quickly looked up your podcasts, and then episode 25 kind of struck me. It's the one about green burial and natural burial, and thinking about all the churches and all the space the Episcopal Church has, and here we have a great graveyard. But can you give us the Reader's Digest version of?
Well, I'll just talk about
that?
it personally.
Yeah.
I keep telling my family, and I've been inspired by a friend to write my medical directive, and I'm going to make it really clear to them. I just want them to roll me up in a sheet and put me in the ground so I can compost a tree as soon as possible. I mean, that's really how bodies were buried up until the Civil War. A lot of bodies in your cemetery had what are now called green or natural burials. They were put in wood boxes. That wood degraded, and they have been feeding those trees. But at the Civil War, because the bodies started stacking up, as we know, and that's when sort of modern funeral practice started with embalming to preserve the bodies to get home. I mean, I love the fact that you guys have cold storage units here. So that's actually going to be in that stories in the future.
That's what a green burial is, right? Because it's not, you don't embalm, cremate, or have a casket, a big metal casket.
Yeah, and so the other thing,
About that term, but including myself, I'm not clear actually how that works. Sorry.
okay, I'll plug a book. Mallory McDuff, who's on that podcast, I think has really wrote one of the definitive works on natural green conservation burial. She's a professor of environmental education at Warren Wilson College. She's, as many of you in this church, she's a cradle Episcopalian and counts bishops and priests, in her family. And so she writes from a faith perspective. Besides, there's now technology that has been developed for turning bodies into compost. And
So Laurel Hill here in Philadelphia is the largest green burial location here in the Delaware Valley. So they have a separate section of the cemetery at Laurel Hill to do green burials.
Laurel Hill.
Laurel Hill.
Sarah, Future Forum.
Yeah.
Get someone, or Adult Ed during the week, get someone from Laurel Hill
Yeah.
to come and
So
talk.
we've when we were doing some work with our churchyard, is that we looked at the practice, and there's some zoning things that have to, political zoning things that occur when you're looking at that. But yeah, so it does occur. The other way of green burials is actually a structure, kind of looks like a freezer vault or a cooler that people are put into, and then they're in a warehouse type building that people can go and visit. And I think it's 3 months that it goes through the process for the breakdown in that chamber. So and then the family can come and take the remains and use where they want, or then the organization then uses it for other uses for feeding other grounds.
It's a long, Archbishop Tutu used a green practice for his burial, and I forget the name of it, is what it was called. But there's different technologies that are being developed to be able to do that. So thanks for teeing that up. I just think it's a conversation, I think, for people, Jay, at my age, it's something we got to talk about.
Closer than we used to be.
April 15th is coming up. What do we all have in common? Death and taxes.
Well, friends, I'm going to wrap us up unless there's another question looming. All right, let us pray. Holy One, we give you thanks for the blessing of our brother Brian, for the word he preached for us this morning, and for the sharing of stories and the building of new relationships. We ask that you bless his work, the work of the wider Episcopal Church, and the work of St. David's, that we may commit to the long path and discern how we can leave a legacy of love upon all the generations to come. All this we ask in the name of Jesus, who is our healer, our teacher, our fellow farmer, and friend. Amen.
Amen.
Can we give Brian a round of applause, please, friends? And if you want to worship outside today, 5 p.m., we're in the outdoor chapel with potluck to follow.